So in today's video, we'll be creating a private S3 bucket for our web app, and I'll be using Pulumi and infrastructure as code to do this. At the end of this video, you have a better understanding of what exactly is infrastructure as code and why you should use it. Infrastructure as code is abbreviated by IaaC. Infrastructure in the context of software is like the foundation of your house that you're building, or in this case, software. So if you're building a house, you need to have a very strong and solid foundation to build upon. And then once the house is built, you can then decorate the inside to make it look nicer and to make it presentable for people to live in. For software, it's exactly the same thing. When you have a software application, you can think of that as like a house. When you go into a house or you go onto a website, what you're seeing is kind of like the front end and the UI and how beautiful this website is. But behind the beautiful looking website and behind all the furniture that's in that house, you have all the foundation that the house is built upon. You need all the electricity set up. You need all the heating and plumbing set up for yourself. You need a solid foundation so that you can make the house look pretty and you can make the house livable in. So in our case, you need a way to serve your website. You need a way to store all your data. You need a way to store images. You need a way to run compute on your website. All of this is done behind the scenes. So that is what infrastructure is in the context of software. It is all the fundamental pieces that you need in order to build a house to live in, or in our case, software to use. So in this video, the infrastructure that we're creating first is an S3 bucket. When you build out a website and a web app, you need a way to store files and images that a user uploads. In the front end, what you see is just a file uploader component. But behind the scenes in the infrastructure, you need an S3 bucket or some sort of blob storage in order to store all those images that a user uploads. The way you would do this is that you would go onto the AWS console and you would create that S3 bucket for yourself. All right, so here I'm in my AWS console, and if I wanted to create an S3 bucket, I would go into the search bar, go into S3, and then click create new bucket. And then you have all these configurations that we can choose from depending on what we need for our web application. So I don't know what the official term for this is called, but I call this configuring and creating things by hand or manually. Every time that you want to create a new resource, you have to go into the console, click on a bunch of buttons, and then you can create it from there. Now, if you're a one-man team and you're just working by yourself, this is probably fine. But now let's say that you wanted to have a production account, a beta account, and a developer account. You want to have different environments to work on so then that you can test your changes before it gets released to the public. Anytime that you make a change to your production AWS account by hand and clicking a bunch of buttons, you have to repeat those steps in your beta environment and in your development environment as well. So because of this, it's very time consuming and it's very error prone because you had to remember all the steps that you took and all the configurations that you made in order to create these resources that you just made. But now let's say you wanted to hire on more people and create a team to build out your web app, and you want each of your developers to have their own AWS account in order to test their infrastructure changes. All of these people will need to replicate your developer account. So they will all have to, once again, create these resources by hand, and you have to know all the configurations that you gave your AWS resources. So we need a better way to create all of these resources for ourselves. We want to automate this process to be repeatable. So then that, let's say you wanted to add a Gamma environment, or you wanted to bring on any amount of people onto your team, there will be an easy way to replicate whatever is in your production AWS account. So what we want to do instead is to create all these infrastructure through code, hence the infrastructure as code. How this would work is every time you wanted to create a new AWS resource or any sort of infrastructure for your web app, you will write code in order to create that infrastructure. So in our case, we're going to be using Pulumi to write out our infrastructure as code. How this works is when you write code to create infrastructure, Pulumi will take that code and break it down into instructions for AWS to create all your resources. So instead of going into the console and clicking a bunch of buttons, you can define all the configurations for your resources through code. And then now you have a programmatic way to define and create your infrastructure in AWS. So you as a developer writes the code, that code gets sent to AWS. AWS will break down that code into instructions in order to create the infrastructure. So now if you want to bring on more people onto your team and you want them to have their own individual AWS accounts, they can pull in that Pulumi code of yours, give it their own AWS account credentials, and then they can deploy those resources onto their own AWS accounts in the same way that your production account has been created. So now that you understand what Pulumi and infrastructure as code is, let's go ahead and set up our Pulumi package and create the S3 bucket for ourselves. So a great way to get started with any new type of framework and service that you use is to read the documentation. If you're new to Pulumi, this guy will help you. I'll probably be using Python for all my stuff. So let's go ahead and install everything. So brew install Pulumi, tap Pulumi. Nice. And then now I want to check the Pulumi version. So I do Pulumi version. I'll get 3.14. Configure Pulumi to access your AWS account. So in a previous video, I created a production and a developer AWS account. And I also created an admin user for both of them. Something that I'm going to be using my developer admin IAM user to test all this out first. So here I need to get my access key and my secret access key from my AWS account. Here I am. users admin security credentials, create access key. So here, when I create the access key, this is what I'll be providing Pulumi and my desktop. So when I spin up my Pulumi code and I want to deploy it to my AWS account, my laptop will have these credentials so that I can deploy it. So click create access key, CLI, create access key. Once you create it, it'll give you the access key here, and it'll also give you the secret access key here. But for your secret key, you need to make sure that this does not get leaked and that you don't expose this to anyone. Never push it to GitHub. So here I want to download the CSV file. So now I need to configure the AWS CLI. So basically with AWS configure profile, you can create different types of profiles for different accounts that you want to use. So in our case, we want to have a dev profile and a production profile. So if I do AWS configure profile, visual utils dev, AWS access key. So this is going to be that public key. And then this is going to be the secret key here. Default region name. I think I'll just default US East 1. Configure list profiles. So I have my visual utils dev onboarded. So eventually I do need to add my production AWS account here, but for now we're just going to deploy everything to our dev account. And then once we know that everything works, we'll just add in our AWS production profile and then deploy it there as well. All right, so if I export AWS profile to be Visual Utils Dev, it should start using this profile as the default. So now we can create the new project. So here you want to make a directory and then do Pulumi new AWS version. Make directory Visual Utils Infra. And then now I want to do Pulumi new AWS Python. So this will create and scaffold my Pulumi package here. If this is your first time running Pulumi new, you may be prompted to log into Pulumi Cloud. Okay, I'll probably log in with GitHub. Okay, I'm not logged in. Welcome to Pulumi. Okay, project name, stack name. What's a stack name again? What is a Pulumi stack? Stack is for different environments. So this is going to be dev. Now it's installing a lot of the dependencies for me. All right, so when you set up your Pulumi program, this is going to be the hello world version of what they have here. So just creating a random S3 bucket for us. All right, so let's go ahead and create this S3 bucket. And then once we feel that we know what we're doing, we can destroy this S3 bucket and then create the code for our own S3 bucket that we need. This command will evaluate your program and determine the resources to update. So if I just run Pulumi up, see what happens. Oh, this is sick. Pulumi gives you a UI for all of this? Oh, this is very nice. But bam, okay. So now that it's created, if I go into my AWS account and then I go into S3, I should have my buckets stored here. Oh, would you look at that? And just like that, we now have Pulumi set up and a way for us to write code down and deploy it onto our AWS account. I created this S3 bucket here, but now I want to destroy it so then I can start again. So Pulumi destroy. So now my Pulumi destroy command just finished. So now if I go into S3, I should see that I don't have any S3 buckets in here. You'll see that this bucket is now gone. So now let's go ahead and create the S3 bucket that we want for our web app. So before we create the S3 bucket, we want to think about all the configurations that we want to add onto this bucket. When you create an S3 bucket or any other resource in AWS, you can define a bunch of configurations that you want to add. So what we want to do here is basically take all of this, but turn it into code. So here I'm just going to write down all the configurations that I want my S3 bucket to have. First one being I want it to be private. Second one being I want it to auto delete resources after a specific amount of days. So for our web app, when a user uploads an image, we'll do RGB splitting on it. Once they download it or once they refresh the page, all the images that are stored in S3 will no longer be accessible to the user. So in that case, we want to auto delete it after a specific amount of time. I believe you need a lifecycle rule. When you want to auto delete, add a lifecycle rule to delete objects that have not been accessed. 1 day. Enabled, delete after 1 day, expiration. So I want to rename my bucket, RGB splitting, user upload. And then I want to have a label here for the stack. If my stack is dev, then my bucket name should be RGB splitting user upload - dev. And then now, like if I have a production stack, then this will be production or gamma or beta or something like that. I was doing curly brackets the whole time. So let's go ahead and create this. So now if I go into S3, go to my buckets, we'll see that I have RGB splitting user upload - dev, lifecycle configuration. If a lifecycle rule, delete after 1 day. Nice. So now we've programmatically created our first S3 bucket for our web app that will allow us to upload images to the RGB splitting user upload bucket. So in order to deploy all this to my production AWS account, I am going to need to create a production Pulumi stack. But before I do that, I do need to create my production AWS access and secret keys so then that I have credentials to deploy to that AWS account. So it's going to be the same process as before that I did for my dev account, but I'm going to do it for my production account. So I just created my key. So now I want to set up my AWS profile for my production account. So AWS configure and then profile. Let's do Visual Utils prod. So here I'm going to give it my access keys, AWS configure list profiles. You see I now have my Visual Utils prod. So now I want to do export AWS profile. So here, instead of using my developer credentials, I now want to use the production credentials that I just added. So now what I want to do is I want to initialize a production stack in Pulumi. So now if I do Pulumi stack ls, it'll list out all of my stacks here. So now if I wanted to know what stack that I'm in, so whether I'm in my developer or in my production one, I can do Pulumi stack show name, and it'll show me that I'm in the production one. So now if I do Pulumi stack select dev, this will choose a developer stack for me. So now if I show it, it shows that I'm using the developer stack. So if I were to do Pulumi up, it'll use the developer stack. So now let's go ahead and switch it back to the production one. So now if I do Pulumi up, so here, Visual Utils and for a prod, and I'm creating the production bucket here. When I define my S3 bucket name, I give it the RGB splitting user upload prefix, and then I append the stack name to it. So because I'm in a production stack, it's going to append prod, which is what we see right here, right? I'm gonna go ahead and click yes. So now if I go back into my S3 and I wait for it to deploy, you see here that I created a bucket named RGB splitting user upload dash prod. So with that, we've created the same exact bucket that we deployed to our developer account onto our production account. Because we defined our S3 bucket through code and we gave it all the configurations, both the buckets in the developer and a production account will be identical. And then with that, our web app is now set up to write infrastructure as code for all the other resources that we need in the future. So every time that we need to add a new S3 bucket, or maybe we need a new Lambda, or any other AWS resource, we'll define it here and then deploy it to our AWS accounts. So with that, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.